Ever find yourself listening to native English speakers, and it's like they're speaking a mile a minute? You pick up a word here, a phrase there, but overall, it just sounds like one big jumbled stream of sounds.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's totally understandable why that happens. It can be super frustrating for English learners. You might know plenty of words, but actually understanding them and putting them all together at native speed, that's a whole other challenge.
Yeah, like you said, it's a challenge. But today, we're going to try to unpack some of that. We're diving into a really interesting YouTube video that breaks down some key tips on how to understand and sound more like a native English speaker.
Oh, cool. What's the video?
It's from the LEP Learn English podcast channel, and it's called 7 Tips for You to Sound Like a Native English Speaker, Ease Podcast, and Chill Beginner. We'll link it in the show notes if you want to check it out yourself.
Awesome. I'll definitely give it a watch. So, what are we going to focus on in our deep dive today?
Well, the video title mentions sounding like a native speaker, but we're going to take a slightly broader approach. We're going to pull out those really practical tips that can help you not only sound more natural, but more importantly, really understand how native speakers communicate in everyday conversations. Think of it as kind of like a cheat sheet to decoding some of the trickier parts of spoken English.
That sounds great. Where do we start?
The video kicks off with a concept that's pretty much the foundation of natural speech: connected speech.
Okay, connected speech. So, what does that mean? How does that actually work in real conversations?
Basically, it's the way native speakers link words together, blending them so they kind of flow into each other, instead of pronouncing each word separately, like you might do when you're reading aloud from a textbook.
Right, right. So it's less about being super precise with every single sound and more about creating the smooth flow.
Exactly. And the video gives a really simple example. Let me see.
Ah, yeah, I can see where that would be a good example.
So if you were to say each word very distinctly, it would be let.me.see.
But when you're speaking naturally, it kind of all runs together, right?
Exactly. It becomes more like, let me see, it almost turns into a single word. The sounds just blend.
Oh, yeah, I hear that all the time. It makes total sense. It's just easier to say it that way.
And the video has another great example. What do you think?
Hmm. I wonder how that one changes.
It becomes something more like, what do you think? The sounds kind of melt together, especially when you're speaking at a normal conversational pace.
Yeah, what'd you think? That sounds way more natural than what do you think?
Definitely. And there's another common one they highlight: I have to go, transforming into I gotta go. I feel like I say gotta about 100 times a day.
Oh, me too. God is super common. It's like have to just get squished down into one quick syllable.
Totally. So we've got Lindsay, what do you think, and gotta go. These are all prime examples of how sounds get linked together in natural speech.
Yeah, and it's not about being lazy with pronunciation. It's more about this natural rhythm and making things easier to say, right?
Absolutely. Our mouths and our brains are always looking for the most efficient way to communicate.
So, how can our listeners get better at picking up on connected speech when they're listening to native speakers? Because I know it can be tough.
Well, the video gives a really cool technique called shadowing. Have you ever tried that?
Shadowing? I feel like I've heard of it, but I'm not totally sure what it is.
Basically, it involves listening to native speakers and then trying to imitate them, mimicking their pronunciation and the way they link those sounds.
Oh, so you're kind of like a shadow trying to follow their every move, but with your voice.
That's a great way to put it.
Hmm.
And they suggest starting with sources where the speech is pretty clear and natural. Things like podcasts, YouTube videos aimed at English learners, or even certain TV shows with clear dialogue.
That makes sense. So you'd listen to a short section, like maybe a sentence or two, and then try to repeat it exactly as you heard it.
Yep, that's the idea. But it's not just about repeating the words. It's about capturing the speed, the rhythm, and even the speaker's tone of voice.
So like how their voice goes up and down, where they put the emphasis.
Exactly. All those subtle things really add to the musicality of the language and help you understand those connected sounds.
That's cool. And I guess the more you practice, the easier it gets to hear those individual words, even when they're all smushed together.
Precisely. And the video even mentions a more advanced technique, speaking along with the audio at the same time.
Whoa, that sounds tough. Like trying to keep up with someone who's speaking really fast.
It definitely takes some practice, but it can really train your mouth muscles to make those sounds in a more natural way.
Makes sense. Now, what if someone's listening and trying to shadow, but they don't catch every word in the connected speech? Should they stop and try to figure it out?
Actually, the video advises against getting too hung up on understanding every single word at the beginning.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the main thing is to just get used to the sounds and how they blend together. Over time, as you become more familiar with these patterns, you'll start to naturally understand more. Your brain will start to make sense of those blended sounds.
Okay, that's good to know. It's reassuring because it can be discouraging to feel like you're missing stuff.
Absolutely. So connected speech is our first tool for unlocking more natural sounding English and better understanding. But the video doesn't stop there. They've got 6 more tips, and the next one delves into the world of idioms.
Ah, idioms. Those are tricky.
They can be. They're those quirky little phrases where the overall meaning isn't obvious if you just look at the individual word.
Right, like piece of cake.
Yeah, exactly. Piece of cake doesn't actually mean you're talking about dessert. It means something is very easy.
And I remember them mentioning spill the beans, which means to reveal a secret.
Spot on.
It hits.
Spill the beans. Totally not about literal beans.
Mm.
So why are idioms so important for English learners?
Well, native speakers use them all the time. They really make conversations more colorful and interesting. But if you don't know what they mean, you can totally miss the point of what someone's saying, even if you understand all the individual words.
It's like hearing the punchline of a joke without knowing the setup. You're kind of left out of the loop.
Exactly. And the video also mentioned that a lot of idioms have really interesting origins connected to culture and history.
Like they talked about hit the sack, meaning to go to sleep. Apparently it might come from a time when people literally slept on sacks filled with straw.
Wow, that's fascinating. I never knew that. So learning idioms isn't just about learning words. It's kind of like a window into the history and culture of English-speaking countries.
Totally. It's like a bonus layer of understanding. So for anyone listening who wants to start using idioms, how do they go about learning them?
The video recommends trying to learn maybe 1 or 2 new idioms each day and then actively using them in your own conversations.
It makes sense to start small and build up your collection. And I guess the more you use them, the more natural they'll start to feel.
Right? They gave a really good example of how to use an idiom, break the ice. It
Mm,
means to start a conversation, especially in a social setting where people might not know each other very well.
yeah, break the ice is a great one. It's a
Yeah.
good reminder that you're not literally breaking any ice.
Right. No need to bring an ice pick to your next party.
Okay, so we've got connected speech and idioms covered. The third tip from the video is all about slang.
Oh, slang. That's the fun stuff.
It definitely is. It's that super informal language that native speakers use all the time, but you usually won't find in a textbook.
Exactly. It's like the secret code of everyday conversations.
And they gave some great examples in the video. Chill, meaning to relax.
Cool for awesome.
Yep. And they even joked about how often they probably say those exact words on their podcast.
Huh. That's funny.
And then there's sick, which can actually mean awesome in slang. That one could be super confusing if you're not familiar with it.
Yeah. Right. Imagine someone saying, that movie was sick. You might think they're talking about a horror movie.
Exactly. And what's tricky about slang is that it changes so quickly. What's cool today might sound totally outdated tomorrow.
So how do you keep up with all the changes?
Well, they had a pretty interesting suggestion. Check out reality shows and TikTok videos.
Oh, that makes sense. Reality shows and TikTok are all about what's trending right now.
Exactly.
Oh.
And they mentioned a recent example they'd picked up, slay, meaning to do something really well, like totally nail it.
Oh, yes, slay. I've heard that one. It's like you totally slayed that presentation.
Right. So learning slang is all about keeping your ear to the ground, listening to how people are actually talking, and being open to new words and phrases.
Definitely. But I guess you got to be careful where you use slang, right?
For sure. It's all about context. You wouldn't want to use slang in a job interview.
Right. You probably wouldn't want to say, I'm going to slay this interview.
Huh. Probably not the best strategy. All right, so far we've got connected speech, idioms, and slang. That's 3 down, 4 to go. The next one is all about intonation.
Intonation. Now that's a fancy word.
It is, but it's actually pretty straightforward. It's all about the music of our speech, how our voice rises and falls when we speak.
Oh, right. Like when you ask a question, your voice usually goes up at the end.
Yep, that's a classic example.
Yeah.
But intonation can convey so much more than just whether you're asking a question.
Really? Like what?
It can show excitement, sarcasm, uncertainty, pretty much any emotion or intention you can think of.
That's pretty cool. So if your intonation isn't quite right, it could lead to some misunderstandings.
Definitely. And the video even talked about a study, intonation as an interface between language and affect.
Whoa, that sounds pretty academic.
It is, but basically it highlights how people rely on these subtle changes in pitch to understand each other's emotions.
So mastering intonation is really important for understanding native speakers and making yourself understood, but how do you actually practice it?
That's a good question. The video suggests really immersing yourself in listening to native speakers and trying to copy their intonation patterns.
Okay, so that means more shadowing.
It is a form of shadowing, but this time you're focusing less on the individual words and more on the melody and rhythm of their speech. Like, try watching a movie or a TV show and repeating lines, really paying attention to how their voice goes up and down.
Ah, I get it. So it's all about tuning your ear to the music of the language, not just the words themselves.
Precisely. Okay, intonation check. Now, the fifth tip is collocations.
Collocations. That one sounds a bit technical. What does it mean?
Don't worry, it's not as complicated as it sounds. The video explains it as words that just naturally go together in English.
So, like, certain words are best friends and always hang out together.
That's a great way to think about it. They gave the example of make a mistake. That's the natural way to say it, but do a mistake, while technically grammatically correct, just sounds a bit off to a native speaker.
Oh, right. I can hear the difference. Do a mistake doesn't quite flow right. So it's not so much about the grammar being wrong, it's about which words sound most natural together, right?
Exactly. And the video makes a good point that native speakers often don't even consciously think about why certain words go together. They just know it sounds right.
It's like a sixth sense for word pairings.
Huh, exactly. So if someone learning English says do a mistake, will they be totally misunderstood?
Probably not, but it might just sound a little strange.
Right, like something's not quite right. And the video emphasizes that using the wrong collocations can make your English sound a bit less fluent, even if people technically understand what you mean.
So how do you learn which words are supposed to go together? It seems like there could be so many combinations.
Well, the best advice is to simply read and listen to a lot of English and really pay attention to how words are used in combination. Don't just memorize individual words. Try to remember phrases and chunks of language.
So instead of just learning the word mistake, you'd learn the whole phrase, make a mistake.
Exactly. It's about training your brain to recognize those natural word pairings.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've covered collocations. What's next?
We're on to tip number 6, and this one is all about contractions.
Oh, contractions. Those are the shortened forms of words, right? Like can't instead of cannot.
You got it. And the video jokingly mentions that this is another reason why native speakers might sound a bit lazy with their language.
Nah, but I totally get it. It's so much easier to say can't than cannot.
Exactly. And they give a great example to show the difference. Imagine saying, I can't believe it. You are the best. It sounds so formal, almost robotic.
It does, like something out of a textbook.
Right. Now compare that to, I can't believe it. You're the best. It just sounds so much more natural and conversational.
Way more natural. So the advice here is to just start using contractions more, especially when you're speaking.
That's the key. Contractions really help the language flow more smoothly, so don't be afraid to use them.
Okay, I'll try to remember that. I can be a bit formal sometimes, so using more contractions would definitely help my English sound more relaxed.
Awesome. All right, we're down to the final tip, and it might be the most important one of all.
Oh, I'm intrigued. What is it?
It's all about real-life practice.
Of course. You can learn all the rules and tips, but if you don't actually use them, it's not really going to stick.
Exactly. The video emphasizes that it's super important to actually practice speaking English in real-life situations, even if it feels a little scary at first.
It can be scary. Like, sometimes I know the grammar rules, but when I'm in a real conversation, I just freeze up.
I think a lot of English learners feel that way. But the more you practice, the more confident you'll become. And they give a great example in the context of ordering at a cafe.
Oh, yeah, what was it?
Instead of just saying one coffee, which can sound a bit blunt, they recommend something like, can I get a coffee, please?
Yeah, that sounds so much more natural and polite. It's not just about the words, it's about the whole way you interact.
Absolutely. And the video suggests that if you don't have tons of opportunities to practice speaking with other people, try to create those opportunities for yourself.
Like how?
You can imagine different scenarios and practice what you would say out loud. You can even role play with yourself.
Oh, yeah, or maybe practice with a language partner or a friend.
Those are all great ideas. So the main takeaway here is to find ways to use English in your everyday life as much as possible.
Got it. Now, besides those 7 tips, they also covered some helpful vocabulary and answered a few questions, right?
They did. They highlighted 10 really useful phrasal verbs and expressions that come up a lot in conversations.
Ooh, I love phrasal verbs. They can be tough, but they're so useful. What were some of the ones they mentioned?
Let's see, there was break something down, be sold on something, let something slip, get the hang of something,
Come across something, mess something up.
keep at something, pick up something, work something into something, and come off as.
Those are all so useful. I'm definitely going to try to use those more often.
And they also answered a few key questions that tied into the tips. Like someone asked, why do native speakers use idioms so often?
And their answer was that idioms make conversations more fun and interesting, and they're also a big part of the culture of the language.
Makes sense. And another question was, what's a good way to learn slang and keep up with the new words?
And they suggested checking out things like reality shows and TikTok videos because slang changes so fast.
Right. And someone else asked, why is intonation so important in English?
To which they replied that intonation helps us understand meaning and emotions, so using it correctly is super important.
Exactly. And the last question was, what's an easy way to learn common collocations?
And their advice was to read and listen to lots of native English and pay attention to words that frequently appear together.
Great recap. So, just to quickly summarize, the 7 key strategies to help you understand and sound more natural in English are connected speech, idioms, slang, intonation, collocations, contractions, and real-life practice.
Wow, that's a lot. It's like a complete toolkit for improving your spoken English.
It is. But the video made a good point. Don't try to do everything at once. Just pick 1 or 2 areas to focus on at first and gradually build from there.
Right, small steps.
Exactly. So for everyone listening, what's one tip from today's deep dive that you want to try this week? Maybe you can challenge yourself to use more contractions, or maybe try slipping a new idiom into a conversation.
Yeah, just give it a try and see how it feels.
And as you go about your week, listening to English through podcasts, music, or conversations, try to pay extra attention to the things we've talked about today. Notice how words connect. See if you can spot any idioms or slang. Listen to the speaker's intonation, and see if you can identify those natural word pairings.
Being aware of these things is half the battle.
So true. Well, that wraps up our deep dive for today. But before we sign off, I want to leave you with a little food for thought. Think about all the elements we talked about: connected speech, idioms, slang, intonation, collocations, contractions. How do these elements show us not just the rules of English, but also the cultural ways of thinking in English-speaking cultures?
That's a really interesting question.
Right. It's something to ponder. As you encounter English in your daily life, try to see those subtle connections between language and culture. It might just open up a whole new level of understanding. Thanks so much for joining us today, and we'll see you on our next deep dive.